Chapter 19 on heredity. Definition of a gene. A gene is a segment of DNA or a sequence of nucleotide bases. We also say that the gene is a unit of inheritance. This picture is trying to differentiate the terms allele versus gene. Basically, each gene can have different forms. Different forms of the same gene are called alleles. For example, the gene for eye color, we can have an allele for brown eyes or an allele for blue eyes. In this case, the allele for brown eyes happen to be dominant and will express its trait when only one allele is present. So let's take a look at the definition of dominant versus recessive allele. Since alleles are different forms of a gene, they occupy the same relative positions on a pair of homologous chromosomes. We describe the genotype as homozygous if both alleles are identical. For example, we have a homozygous dominant genotype or a homozygous recessive genotype. If the alleles are different, it will be a heterozygous at the genotype. Let's take a look at the definition of phenotype versus genotype. The phenotype is the physical expression of a gene, whereas a genotype is the genetic makeup of the organism. So during meiosis, gamete, which is the sex cell with only one gene for each characteristic. So we are looking at 23 pairs divided by 2, that's 23 chromosomes, each from each parent. So right now we have covered the terms dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, phenotype versus genotype. Now for codominant or codominance, it is the expression of both alleles equally. So for example, I have a big B that codes for red color or small b allele that codes for white color. Because both expresses its trait equally, both alleles are codominant to each other, I will have red with white spots. Let's also use the following diagram to revise the genetic diagram. So in this case, the phenotype is written. Parents are tall versus short. Genotype is the genetic makeup. Homozygous dominant with homozygous recessive. Remember to circle your gametes, right, and do the cross. The first cross is actually called the F1 generation. In this case, there was another cross, and you can call this the F2 generation. So when you cross a heterozygous with a heterozygous, you actually get a 3:1 ratio of tall is to short phenotype. So just now was the same example of a heterozygous with a heterozygous. Let's focus on this one here, which is a heterozygous with a homozygous recessive. You actually get a 1:1 ratio. If you are looking at brown being the dominant one, there will be 1:1 brown is to blue eyes. And the very common one that we know would be if it's homozygous dominant with homozygous recessive, you will get all heterozygous. Please take note, don't call this carrier, do not call the phenotype a carrier, state the trait. Let's also use the following diagram to revise some of the crosses. So phenotype, we're looking at what we can see, tall versus short. The genotype is the genetic makeup. Remember to circle your gametes. Okay, and then you do your cross. And then show your phenotypic ratio. For example, 3:1 in this case. For this particular scenario whereby there's more than one cross, we can call the first one the F1 generation, then the second generation. And in this case, the F2 generation was taking 2 heterozygous. And therefore, the final ratio is 3:1. Let us use another version to recap all the possible observed ratios. So simple crosses for 3:1, as we mentioned, it can be a heterozygous with a homozygous recessive. it can be a heterozygous with heterozygous. So far, we've covered the terms dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, phenotype, and genotype. Now, for codominance, we are looking at both traits or both alleles expressing both traits.